In this video, we're going to be examining more of the closing statement of prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson. I thought this would make an interesting contrast with the last video that I made on Ben Meyer's closing speech. This is a continuation of the three videos that you can see on the screen now, in which I dealt with earlier arguments made in the prosecution closing speech. This portion of the speech focuses on baby F or child F. I always refer to them as child A, child B, etc. Often in the court case they're referred to as baby A, baby B. So this is child F or baby F. This is one of the two insulin cases in the court case. So I'm going to go through all of the arguments made here by Nick Johnson. There are some pretty ridiculous ones, needless to say. So he begins by saying we're moving on to baby F. So he says Lucy Letby knew what the effects of neonatal hypoglycemia were. She told the police in interview, and she told you in evidence. Now, this is akin to saying Lucy Letby was a nurse, because all neonatal nurses will obviously know what the effects of hypoglycemia would be. Indeed, I'd hazard a guess that many people outside of the medical profession would know what the potential effects of hypoglycemia were. So, immediately, obviously this is Nick Johnson saying she knew what the consequences of her alleged actions would be. But all this really says is that she was a nurse. Every single other nurse on the unit would also have known. In fact, I dare say every single neonatal nurse in Britain would know. So move on to the next bit. Importantly, she also told the police and you that at the time of these events she did not know about c-peptide. So I want you to listen very carefully to this next sentence. Therefore, if you are sure that it was she who poisoned the bag or the bags of TPN, we suggest that you would have little difficulty in concluding that she intended to kill baby F. So this is a technique. Nick Johnson's used this technique previously. I assume barristers use this technique all the time. So I'm just going to go into a bit of an examination of this technique and explain what he has done here. So if you just look at the two sentences, the second sentence doesn't follow logically on from the first sentence. You cannot infer the second sentence from the first sentence. And we're going to return to this topic later when Nick Johnson makes his central argument that he's trying to set up here. But you can't reasonably say that because Lucy didn't know about c-peptide, you would therefore have little difficulty in concluding that she intended to kill baby F. That's just not something that can be reasonably inferred from this. So we'll see Johnson return to this argument later on, but he's just trying to sneak something past the jury that doesn't make logical sense. And we'll see later on that the arguments about c-peptide don't make sense either. So we'll return to the comments of Nick Johnson. And he says here in this passage, and you will not forget, not least because I won't let you forget, that by the time baby L was poisoned, the level of insulin in baby L's blood was double what it was in baby F's. So this point is disputable, but I'm not going to go over it in this video because we're going to deal with child L in a future video. We're just going to deal with child F in this video. So he continues, so the poison had failed to kill baby F, and 7 months later, by the time we get to baby L, the level of insulin in the blood is twice what it was for baby F. That tells you a lot about intention, doesn't it? Well, if we go through the timeline of babies from child A to child L, then we will learn a lot about intention, Nick. So Lucy Letby supposedly begins with child A, in which she supposedly successfully causes death by the injection of air. Then with child C, she supposedly successfully causes the murder of this infant by using air down the nasogastric tube. Although I should say that no one actually knows what the allegations are with regard to this infant, because Dr. Evans has changed his mind and shifted things around so many times, we literally don't know what he actually believes. Then for child D, she reverts back to the injection of air again and supposedly successfully murders this infant. Then with child E, she supposedly uses the nasogastric tube. Oh no, that doesn't work. So it's an indeterminate object in some unspecified way to damage child E in order to explain the 25% plus blood loss of this infant which is supposedly successful. Then with child F, she then supposedly reverts to insulin, which would be much more detectable and is unsuccessful. So then with child G, she then switches to overfeeding with milk, which is unsuccessful. With child H, she then supposedly tampers with the endotracheal tube of this infant, although the infant does not die. Then with child I, she goes back to air down the nasogastric tube, although Dewi Evans has abandoned this mechanism now, so whether we can still say he believes that she used air down the nasogastric tube for this infant, we can't really say, because he's backed away from this diagnosis completely. Then with child J, she reverts again to maliciously obstructing the airway of this infant. Then with child K, she has another go at dislodging an endotracheal tube, again unsuccessfully. And then with child L, she reverts back to insulin, this time supposedly using twice as much, and is again unsuccessful. There's only one word for that, and it's crap. It's absolute crap. There is no way that this has ever happened. It's just, I would say it's a figment of Dr. Evans' imagination, but that makes him sound more intelligent than he is. He just sat there trying to come up with methods of malfeasance. That's why he had to come up with so many different ones, because the clinical signs were different. And the other point I should also make is that I've listed there the supposed methods of malfeasance for infants A to L. And there was still going to be more methods introduced. Several more methods will be introduced before the end of the court case between infants L and infant Q. So that just shows you how preposterous it is. But we'll continue now with the words of Nick Johnson. So I'm going to read out this whole passage and then we'll address the argument that he's making. Now, baby A, his death had nothing to do with what was in his dextrose bag. I'm skipping about a bit. I'm back to baby A just to make a point. For reasons that you will understand, we suggest that Lucy Letby knew that it was nothing to do with what was in the bag. But you'll remember that when she was interviewed about baby A, she told the police that in the aftermath of baby A's collapse, she had asked for the bag to be kept. Do you remember that? It's a dextrose bag back in June 2015. You will remember she said she labelled it, I think, and put it in the sluice room. And her friend Nurse A was asked about that, and she confirmed that Lucy Letby had asked for the bag to be kept, and there was never an examination of the bag, was there? That you may think is quite important because a child, this is baby A, was attached to a bag. He died within a short time, and the bag was never examined. That would give, or could give, if you were determined to injure a child, give you perhaps a degree of confidence that if you tried it again, no one would actually examine the bag. She knew no one would examine it. And when Lucy Letby was being interviewed about baby F, back to baby F we suggest, in effect, she taunted the police saying, have you got the bag? I'm not saying that's the exact phraseology or the tone in which she said it. Well, you are, Nick, because you just said she taunted the police. So you are suggesting that's the tone in which she said it. But she repeatedly asked the question in interview. So, I'll read the next passage out as well. Have you got the bag? Because she knew, didn't she, that the police didn't have the bag. And she thought that the fact they didn't have the bag would give her a free pass, but she was wrong. So he's going to go on to a different argument in a second, which I'll address in a second. But this is obviously Nick Johnson suggesting that Lucy's question about the bag is significant. So there are numerous problems with this and numerous things that need to be broken down. So I'll go through this now. So let's count the problems with this passage, which is particularly deceitful, even for a passage in this court case. So the first thing is that this is presented as some sort of unique incident, whereas we know for a fact that bags were kept for other infants in the case, and this was requested by doctors on the unit. This was rightly not seen as being suspicious. Lucy was not the on-duty nurse, nor did she hang the bag, and wouldn't be involved in its preservation. This is yet another example of weaponising normal nursing conduct. It's normal for her, in the case of child A, to ask them to retain the bag. That's not a bad thing to do, and it's not her fault that the bag for child F wasn't retained. But we'll get onto that more in a second. The next thing is that Lucy didn't know that the police didn't have the bag. This doesn't make any sense. There's no basis on which to make this assertion. There's no reason she would know that they didn't keep the bag. She also didn't know that the bag wasn't examined for child A. That's not her department or responsibility, so that claim is erroneous. It cannot be stated with any confidence that she knew the bag for child F wouldn't be examined. There's an argument that it should be examined, but why would she know that it hadn't been examined? She wasn't even the on-duty nurse. She wasn't the nurse who hung this bag up. It's nothing to do with her, essentially. Although logically no one would expect this bag to be examined because the infant didn't die, and therefore there was, in a sense, no reason to examine it. Considering that they did get some insulin measurements from the laboratory that were unusual, and there should have been follow-up testing, all these things that we know about that we've discussed in previous videos, maybe you can make an argument for it. But plausibly, it's perfectly plausible, I'd say even logical to say, that because the infant didn't pass away, they didn't examine the bag. They didn't they didn't think of keeping the bag. They didn't think of doing the follow-up measurements, etc., because they didn't view this as a significant case. Indeed, it's only later on that this arcane theory of hypothetically lacing the feeding bags was cooked up. They didn't even think of it at the time, because it's probably the only time in human history that this allegation has ever been made. I'm not aware of it being made in any other court case. Certainly it hasn't been made in any of the other nursing cases that have happened in this country. So if someone can point to another case in which someone has supposedly laced a feeding bag of an infant with insulin, then I'm happy to look at it, but I've not encountered one at this point in time. So understandably, at the time on the unit, no one thought that this was possible. And indeed, there is no evidence for this, let alone proof. But this is another reason why it's illogical to compare the two. You're comparing a death, in the case of child A, with a surviving infant. So that was why Lucy has correctly asked for the bag of child A to be preserved. In the case of child F, this is why the bag was not preserved, which is nothing to do with Lucy anyway, as I mentioned. And then finally, the bag was never examined. This whole allegation is completely hypothetical, and this whole passage is simply an attempt to gloss over the fact that there was no direct testing of the bag, or the theory that the discredited Hindmarsh has concocted in court. So there's quite a lot of problems. I don't know if you could reasonably describe any of it as lying, but it's very obviously deliberate misrepresentation of what has occurred. And we're also going to look at the moment that Nick Johnson references, where he said Lucy asked whether or not they'd preserve the bag. Because he made this, he attempted to make this sound like some hugely significant moment. So let's look at that and see what was actually said. So I'm going to show you police transcripts where child F is discussed. Now, you can see here that the word bag appears 81 times in this document. There's a handful here at the start in relation to child A and child B. All the rest are in relation to child F. So they're discussing this bag. It's been mentioned, 77 times in relation to child F in this police interview. And you'll see, I'm not going to read it all out. Obviously, this goes on for a very, very long time. I'm not going to read very much of it out at all. But you can see it's the usual thing of Lucy just answering questions. And so it goes on, and so it goes on. And she's asked all kinds of questions. At some point, she's talking about how it's difficult to gain entry to this bag. She's been asked about whether she hung the bag up, etc., etc. All these various things. It goes on and on and on and on. She must have been answering questions for an hour on this, I would say. I mean, it really goes on for page after page after page. We keep going and keep going and keep going. Still going. And then eventually we're going to get to the significant bit that I just want to read out, which is here. So we'll come up to here. Now, again, this is something Lucy has done that's been used against her. So whether or not she should have done it is debatable again, but it's a very difficult situation. Now that I've spoken to a solicitor, if I was in this situation, I know that I would say, look, I'm not going to answer any questions at all. I want to write down the questions that you're going to ask me, and then I'll give you a full statement. It'll be an extensive statement. I'm not going to sit here answering questions. And I think that would always be an advisable thing to do. Unfortunately, her solicitor seemingly did not advise her to do this, and she sat there answering questions for 23 hours, not knowing that the police would later make a documentary, so-called documentary, in which they used a handful of times where she said no comment against her. And there have been suggestions that in some of these court transcripts that Lucy saying no comment has been cut out, but I firstly don't think that's likely if you actually look at the flow of the interviews. And secondly, even if it is true, she still answered an enormous number of questions without saying no comment. I mean, if she did say no comment more than we know, it's still an incredibly small proportion of the interview as a whole. I think that's undeniable. Anyway, I want to just have a look at this bit where so they say here, did you unintentionally cause him harm on the 5th of August? Not that I know of, no. We talked about insulin and the effects of insulin, didn't we, on blood sugar levels? Did you inject insulin into baby F? No. Can I, and then this is Lucy, can I just ask a question about this in terms of the bags and everything? So this is something that Nick Johnson is now referencing in his speech. Now, I'm not a solicitor. I don't know if this is advisable, but I think it'll become clear why Lucy does ask this question. They go, yes. I'm assuming they haven't been kept or checked, post events. So the police say, would they be kept somewhere? You said that they might be. And Lucy says, no, it would be disposed of. That's what I'm saying. We've got no bags. Well, the date of it is 2015, yeah. Is it likely that the bags will be kept? No. For that long? No. You've asked the question, so are there occasions when they might be? If there's a baby that there's been a concern about, we would keep the bag usually and ask somebody to check that bag or check the pump, which is exactly what I've just told you. That's why Lucy said, keep the bag for child A, because the infant passed away. And that's why, not that she's on duty or anything to do with this, she's nothing to do with this whatsoever, but that's why you wouldn't necessarily keep the bag for child F. But she wouldn't know that had happened. But her saying keep the bag for child A is not suspicious. That's normal. And she goes on to explain if there's something that's unexplained, then you should keep the bag. Now, arguably, they should have kept the bag, given that there were insulin measurements done, and it went away to this laboratory in Liverpool, and they did do measurements. Now, we know scientifically, medically, certainly forensically, what they've done is flawed and should not be used as evidence in a court case. But there were at least some measurements done, albeit with a presumptive test. So clearly, you would think under those circumstances that they would keep the bags. And there's notes in other cases I've mentioned where they have kept bags. But this is not really, well, I'll read the rest of it before I speak about it some more. So the police say, okay, if there's an unexplained, are you aware if that was the case with baby F? No, that's what I'm asking, if anything was kept. Right, would you know where they would keep that? If there's a concern, it would usually be kept in the sluice. Right, okay, is that on the neonatal unit? Yes. Would that have been recorded anywhere if there was a reason to keep any equipment? No, it was just, they'd usually just write on the bag, can we have this bag checked? And the shift leader would pass it on to the next member of staff. Okay, is there a reason why you've asked that question? What's going through your mind? When something's happened in that time, you're asking me if I have given him insulin. I'm wondering if there's an issue with something else. Right, okay, obviously we'll look into that, but I doubt 4 years down the line, no. And that concluded the interview so far as baby F was concerned on that date. So what Lucy is really doing here is, as an innocent person, she's saying, look, have you got any evidence? Can you get this bag and can you test it to clear me? She's looking for exonerating evidence. Now, whether or not, again, I think this indicates far too much trust in the police, of course. But you can see from this account, and this is just the account that was read out in court that Nick Johnson is referring to, that it gives a completely different series of events from that which he attempts to put into the court case, and the inferences that he makes from it are all provably incorrect if you actually look at what was said. So we'll return to the comments of Mr. Johnson. So that he's talking about the bag, and then he says, continuing from here, because what she didn't know about was c-peptide. Professor Hindmarsh told us, Professor Hindmarsh, you'll remember, told us that the relative consistency of the blood sugar levels in child death through August the 5th meant it was legitimate to infer that there was a consistent level of insulin being administered to him throughout the day when the TPM was running from 0.25, when that was noted by Lucy Letby on the 5th of August. So I'm not going to get into all the technical aspects of the insulin in this video, because firstly, because I've dealt with them previously, and also because I can't discuss everything that I know, because it's part of the reports, and we can't really get into those reports as I would like to, because it's just not possible. Obviously, we know about Professor Hindmarsh. We know about the discredited Professor Hindmarsh, who didn't reveal that he was under investigation and so forth, who was deregistered as a doctor, who's been in the Guardian newspaper now, and we know the prosecution kept this from the court. What is important to say about this bit is that it doesn't follow logically that because Lucy Letby didn't know about c-peptide, that this gave her some sort of open goal opportunity to poison infants with insulin. That essentially is a ridiculous inference for several reasons. The first reason is virtually no one knows about c-peptide. I'd never even heard the term used before I began looking into the Lucy Letby case. That would apply to most people. It obviously applied to Lucy, as she explained in the police interviews. I could read that bit out, but I won't. She just very quickly explains that she doesn't understand any of the figures and doesn't know anything about it. The second thing is that just because this mechanism of insulin to c-peptide ratio is deemed significant in this court case, that doesn't mean that Lucy Letby believes or should believe that, I can just poison infants with insulin and no one will know. Because on what basis can you say that? It's absolutely preposterous. And then I suppose the third thing to say is that we know this decoupling of the insulin and c-peptide levels is not as significant as presented here. And I think essentially all of Professor Hindmarsh's evidence really now is called into question. Obviously, from a factual basis, it was already pretty poor to begin with, but now just him as a witness should certainly be considered suspect, in my opinion. So then Mr. Johnson goes on to say the following. So we heard, you'll remember, quite a lot from Dr. Milan about the quality assured procedures at the lab at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, and that the results of her or her lab's blood analysis were reliable. So there's a few things to say about that. I've discussed all these things previously, but I will go over them again here. Firstly, if funding forensic testing hadn't been downgraded in this country, then there would have been better testing for this court case. That's the first thing. The second thing is Dr. Milan has something of a vested interest to defend the laboratory that she's representing. And then thirdly, this notion of the analysis being reliable, that has a very narrow technical meaning. The fact is that this is a presumptive test. It's not a forensic test. We know that. We know what the official guidelines are with regard to this. We know what the guidelines written on the test are. We know that it shouldn't have been used for this purpose. That's just simply undeniable again. I don't know why Dr. Milan gave the evidence he did. As I say, partly she's under pressure to defend her laboratory, essentially, which is another reason why having private sector companies operating in this kind of scenario is not necessarily ideal. But given that absolutely everything in this country is falling apart and being defunded, I don't suppose we can be too surprised that forensic testing in court cases is also falling apart. You will remember that in evidence, this is Nick Johnson continuing, Lucy Letby herself appeared to accept there was insulin in baby F's TPM bags. So obviously this is one of the most discussed aspects of the court case. It's not reasonable to say that Lucy Letby accepted there was insulin in baby F's TPM bag. What she said was, if you're saying there was, then I can't contest that because I'm not qualified. All I know is that I didn't do anything, which is completely different. I mean, it was... Obviously, this is a manipulative technique that's been used by both the police and the prosecution. So then Nick Johnson says, now the bag which was hung by Lucy Letby was produced in the aseptic unit at the County Chester Hospital on August the 4th. We can see the prescription for it at tile 144. There you see the original sign by Dr. Beach and then Dr. Wood underneath. So it's just worth mentioning, of course, that this bag was never tested. So he's talking about a bag being hung up by Lucy Letby, but this bag was never tested by anyone. We know that for a fact. So it doesn't really mean anything essentially is using deflection techniques to say, oh look, we've established that this is significant, we've established that that is significant, Lucy Letby has accepted this, Lucy Letby has said this, and now we've got the bag. But we know for a fact the bag wasn't preserved. You've already conceded the fact the bag wasn't preserved, so this bag can be of no significance whatsoever. It can just be a bag that fed the infant perfectly safely and was then discarded. It doesn't mean anything. So he continues, and you can see Lucy Letby's by now familiar handwriting and signature. It was back on November 29th last year that we called Ian Allen from the lab to give evidence. Let's just reflect on the first sentence a second. So again, he's saying, oh look, we keep seeing Lucy Letby's writing on everything. It's kind of an extension of the it's always Lucy theory. But the only reason we've seen Lucy's handwriting on everything is because they've highlighted various things. Many of these things are utterly spurious. I mean, of course, Lucy Letby has signed things, and of course, Lucy Letby has written things on the unit. That would be perfectly normal for any nurse. Nick Johnson's trying to make this sound like it's some sort of, oh, look at this relentless presence of Lucy Letby's handwriting. Of course, she's going to have written things down. So then he continues, it was back on November 29th last year that we called Ian Allen from the lab to give evidence, and he was the man who was in charge of the unit at the time. Do you remember him explaining the painstaking, deliberate way in which the bags were produced? And he made it clear, didn't he, that there wasn't the slightest chance that any insulin was put into baby F's bespoke TPN bag in the pharmacy, and that wasn't challenged on Lucy Letby's behalf. So, essentially, this is all irrelevant. It is difficult to go through this bit and say anything too constructive because simply there haven't been any insulin poisonings. So this is all essentially irrelevant. So ladies and gentlemen, you can be sure that when that bag went up to that unit, it was not contaminated. If you're in any doubt about that, we invite you to consider 4 points. First, we invite you to rewatch the video which shows the painstaking procedure in the aseptic unit and bring back to mind the evidence of Mr. Allen. Second, remember what happened to baby E 24 hours before baby A was poisoned. Baby E had been murdered. What are the chances of his twin being attacked by a poisoner and the poisoner not being the same person who attacked baby E? So let's just stop a second. All this stuff about contamination is irrelevant, really, because they haven't even tested anything, so it's all meaningless. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we can't really expand on any of these points because they're just essentially irrelevant. Because what is being presented as a open and shut case of insulin poisoning is anything but, because of what we know about the testing, what we know about the physical state, you might describe it as, of neonates. And we know that this renders the decoupling of insulin and c-peptide irrelevant because it's just not as unusual in very, very small infants. Of course, it should be emphasised these are tiny, tiny babies. We sometimes forget that. I find it difficult to picture them myself, but we're not talking about an adult. We're not talking about a child. We're not even talking about a newborn baby. We're talking about, in some cases, tiny, tiny little infants. And their anatomy and their physical signs just behave in a completely different way. So all of that needs to be mentioned. Now, we also have this comment here about baby E and baby F. So this is something, again, this is another technique that Nick Johnson has used where he tries to group together family members as if that's somehow significant. Of course, what is never mentioned, particularly by the prosecution, I don't think it's mentioned enough by the defence from what I've seen, is that there was an extraordinarily high proportion of multiple births on this unit. Now, you've heard me talk about this recently. You've heard Dr. Martin Pittman talk about this recently. I know it's cited in the Botched film that's on Lucy Letby Films. This is highly significant. So the fact that they're twins, Nick Johnson's always trying to make some sort of mental and emotional link between various infants in the case, but the fact that they're twins just makes them more vulnerable. And also, finally, let's just note, it hasn't been established that Child E died due to the nefarious action of Lucy Letby. In fact, it's very obvious that Child E died due to a gastrointestinal hemorrhage. I mean, it's absolutely blindingly obvious. I've spoken to numerous neonatal experts, both in nursing and medical aspects of neonatal practice, and everyone agrees that it's just very obviously a gastrointestinal bleed. That's why Dr. Evans had to invent this utterly, I think it's reasonable to describe it as batshit theory that he's put together, and even had to revise his own stupid theory, because He started off with it being a nasogastric tube and then decided, oh, well, we couldn't do with a nasogastric tube. Let's just say it's some instrument. Let's just say Lucy Letby's done this, or let's just say Lucy Letby's done that. And it's nowhere near being a medical diagnosis. I mean, in my view, nothing he's done in this court case, Dr. Evans, is a medical diagnosis, but Child E is just absolute pie in the sky. It's total rubbish. So Mr. Johnson is now going to expand on his brilliant theory. In other words, do you think it's a realistic possibility that either two people were independently attacking children in the neonatal unit and they both just happened to have selected both twins? Or do you think it's a possibility that it's a matter of chance and baby F got insulin the day after his brother was murdered? So it would follow, ladies and gentlemen, if you agree with that, then the murderer has to be someone who was working on both night shifts. And to get to the bottom of that, I'm not asking you to put these up now, but if you look at tile 155 in the baby E sequence and tile 101 of the baby F sequence, that gives you the staff lists for each shift. There are only 3 people working both shifts. Valerie Thomas, who was a nursery nurse and therefore would never have been in nursery 1 when baby E was attacked and wouldn't have the keys to the locked fridge. The second person is Belinda Williamson, Belinda Simcox. She was working both shifts and she was a person selected. Do you think it's a matter of coincidence, matter of chance, now thinking about this, to make that note at 2200 hours for baby E? So we could continue. They're going to go on further, but I just want to point out a few things in these paragraphs. So the first thing, as I mentioned, is he's still trying to make this link between Child E and Child F, this kind of emotional link that they're twins and you're attacking the same family. I mean, it's incredible that Child E is in a court case. It's and what is perhaps even more incredible is that it's arguably not the weakest case in the court case, even though it's absolutely blindingly obvious that this was just a naturally occurring gastrointestinal hemorrhage and the baby bled to death and it wasn't treated properly and there should have been a blood transfusion and there should have been a post-mortem, etc., etc. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is that they're relying on shifts again. They rely on shifts all the way through the court case. That happens all the way. So it's just, oh, look, this person was on duty, therefore they've committed all the crimes. And then we'll get on to discuss this other thing that Nick Johnson is introducing here about the times that are signed for. So Mr. Johnson says here, an interesting coincidence. While she was working, she was also working when baby L was poisoned. The third person who was common to both shifts was Lucy Letby, who of course had been baby E's designated nurse, and who from the signature, it is clear, hung the bag for baby F. So it comes down to a choice between two, doesn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Belinda Williamson or Lucy Letby. And that's where you factor in baby L and baby M. Baby M also attacked with air like baby E. I mean, there's no prospect whatsoever that Child E was attacked with air. I mean, it's just absolutely preposterously ridiculous. It's a joke. It's actually an absolute joke that Dr. Evans has even put that into the case for Child E. There's nothing about Child E that would state that this was an air embolism or the injection of air, or that the infant was in any way destabilised by air, or that there are any symptoms related to air. The child bled to death, lost 25% of his blood at least, and probably more. It's probably more like 35%, due to a gastrointestinal hemorrhage. It's just very obvious. And as I say, if you speak to anyone with any medical qualifications, particularly neonatal qualifications, they will tell you that. You don't even really need to see the medical notes for that case. But those who have seen the medical notes will know that it's a gastrointestinal hemorrhage. So to bring all these things together, it instantly discredits this entire section. Baby M is also an absolute farce of a case as well. So, I mean, all of these associations that are being made, I suppose from Nick Johnson's perspective, he obviously doesn't actually have a clue about what he's talking about, of course. So he's just informed by the theories of Dr. Evans, and so therefore he may view this as somewhat more reasonable. He doesn't know that he's presenting a prosecution case that is just absolute crap. He may not. There's a possibility that he could realise that some of it is not very solid, but it's unlikely because he doesn't know the first thing about medical matters. And all he's ever heard from is the prosecution expert who said, this is definitely correct, this is definitely correct, this baby definitely died due to this. So although there are aspects of this that I think are deliberately misleading and deliberate misrepresentation, I will point those out when they occur. It's possible, and I do think, and I should say, I do think this linking the cases together is one of those. I think that is a deliberate misrepresentation, but it's possible that he thinks some of these arguments are legitimate. Yeah, and I mean, Nick Johnson is obviously an experienced barrister, and it's not for him to get involved, really, in the matter of whether or not a client is innocent or guilty, but he may very well believe that Lucy Letby is guilty based on what he's been told, and he may think the ends justify the means. I don't think he really cares that much, because I think he'd do this regardless. I think he even if he 100% knew someone was innocent, he'd still try to win the case, by any means, fair or foul. But it is just worth mentioning that it's quite possible Nick Johnson genuinely believes Lucy Letby is guilty, or certainly at the time. Obviously now he should have more doubts, but barristers do live in this very strange world in which the truth doesn't really matter. What matters is how well you litigate, and then a verdict is reached, and then that becomes the truth. That becomes reality. That supersedes reality. However, I just do think it's worth making the point that we have been critical of Mr. Johnson, and that's entirely reasonable in my opinion, but he's been ensconced with Dr. Evans, and he might just think this is all perfectly reasonable. I'm sure he's intelligent enough to realise that he has made arguments that are poorly founded and that are misrepresentations, and he knows that he said things that are untrue. But he also might think a lot of what he's saying is true and legitimate. Not that he cares, because he just wants to do his job, and this is what barristers do. But I do think it's quite possible that he thinks Lucy's guilty. So he can. So here he's going on about, and baby L, as we will see, got more than one bag of his poisoned, in his case, dextrose. So you just cannot say that. I mean, you just cannot make that statement at all. There's nothing random, ladies and gentlemen, about what was going on in that neonatal unit. These are not random poisonings. When you take that into account, when you take into account all the other evidence from all the other cases, it's obvious, isn't it, who was responsible? There's only one person who could be responsible. So this is the it's always Lucy theory. So the shift chart, not deemed to be of any significance, you see, it comes up over and over and over again. It could only be Lucy. It's always Lucy. Look at this chart we've got. She's always on duty. Every incident's Lucy. And that was used as inference all the way through the court case. Baby F's TPM bag was delivered by a pharmacist to the unit about 4 p.m. on the 4th of August, and it was stored in a locked fridge. Only one set of keys for the fridge, and only the registered nurses were entitled to have the keys. Let me note, I didn't note this earlier on, there was never any allegations made about when insulin was accessed, who had the keys, when they had the keys, when they used the keys to access the insulin, and when insulin was used and when it was missing, really. None of that was put forward because there's no evidence to support any of that. We'll go on at some point to look at the defence of Ben Myers in his closing statement on the insulin cases, and it'll be interesting to see exactly what he says. But it seems extraordinary to me that you're saying someone poisoned infants with insulin. Okay, well, where's the missing insulin? We're not going to make any effort to do that. When did they get the keys? Don't know. When did they access? Don't know. Quite incredible. And in the fridge with the TPN was that little vial of insulin that we haven't accounted for at all. You can look at it if you want. I'm sure you remember it. It's probably difficult to see from there, that tiny, tiny vial of insulin. So the bag was poisoned by someone who had access to the fridge, and was also done sometime after 1600 hours on the 4th of August. So pretty precise, Nick. It was poisoned by someone who had access to the fridge at some sort of time on some sort of date. And with regards to the tiny, 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 tiny vial of insulin, this is another thing that is suggested by people who are far more qualified than me, I should add, that the amount of insulin used and then the figures that came out are just not pharmacologically possible. It hasn't been demonstrated that it's pharmacologically possible. There isn't any research to indicate that it's pharmacologically possible. And of course, they didn't do the follow-up testing that was required to back up this presumptive testing that was done. So it may be that not only has Lucy Letby not engaged in these poisonings, but that also that they are literally pharmacologically impossible. So I'll read out the next 2 paragraphs and then I'll assess that in a second. Just looking at this case in isolation, there is a limited number of candidates, isn't there? And we heard, I think, from all of them, and we suggest you can dismiss the possibility that anybody else other than Lucy Letby poisoned that or those bags. I've already dealt with this argument once. one of the questions might be posed to you is, well, how was it done? Well, we don't have to prove how it was done, ladies and gentlemen, because the evidence shows that it was done. So I will actually respond to that now. So firstly, the judge has allowed this by saying you don't have to show the mechanism. If you just think there's been nefarious activity, you can find her guilty. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, of course, the prosecution can't prove how it was done because nothing was ever measured. So, as I've said several times already, this is all entirely hypothetical. This is not a proven mechanism. As I just said, it's quite possible that the figures that the prosecution are going to put forward, that they did put forward in the court case, cannot actually be recreated pharmacologically in a laboratory. Like it may be literally pharmacologically impossible, but don't worry because they don't have to prove it anyway. If they don't have to prove the mechanism, they don't have to prove when the insulin was accessed, they don't have to prove how it was accessed, they don't have to prove that they have the bags, they don't need to do a test after they've had the presumptive test. What do they have to do? So the next paragraph is this kind of demonstration that occurred in court, supposed debunking of the so-called tamper-proof port myth. So there is supposed to be a tamper-proof port, and then this Mr. Allen showed you exactly how the supposed tamper-proof port can be bypassed, that can be opened and resealed, contrary to what Lucy Letby said at page 5 of her Baby F interviews. So Lucy Letby wasn't using that as a defence. She was just asked about it. So we'll look at exactly what was said before we go any further. So this is what Lucy said when questioned by the police. So police question, okay, you say it's yellow in colour. Is there any port to this particular bag to add things to it? No, there's the end valve that you'd break off to attach a syringe. I don't think there's anything else. Right. And is it something that you can add things to if needs be? No, we don't add to TPN. No? It's made by the pharmacy and it's a secure bag. We don't. Right. Is there any reason at all at any time you would add anything to the TPN bag? No, not that I'm aware of, no. No, but is it designed if someone wanted to add something to it? Is it designed for that purpose? Is there an access port? Not sure. I can't remember if that one has got a port or not. So you can see that this is not something that Lucy made a big deal out of. She was just asked about it, and she said, as far as I know, it's completely secure. So this demonstration that occurred in court, this so-called demonstration, even if that's accurate, which is debatable because I've spoken to people and they say it's probably not even accurate, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that this demonstration was accurate. We're talking about some quite esoteric knowledge here. It's not something that many people know about. It's not something that many people would have considered. It's certainly not something Lucy would have known about. Do you think Lucy would have known that, oh, actually, you can use this obscure technique to actually get into the port and then reseal the bag and then no one would know? When has she done this anyway? It's yet another logistical impossibility, I would suggest. Even if it's feasible to do, and even if she knew about it, there's nothing in these question answers here that would indicate that she would know about it. And it's not exactly what we know for a fact that she never looked up methods of murder, she never looked up insulin, etc., online anyway. But leaving that issue aside, it's not something you can look up online. Is there an obscure way to nefariously add insulin to a TPM bag and then reseal it and no one will know? This is something that only a handful of people would know, if anyone even knew at all. It could be just like maybe one or two people that from the manufacturers know it. That's even if it's true. It's debatable whether the demonstration is even correct. But if you look at these two statements together next to each other, it's Nick Johnson trying to make a big deal out of this because, again, he's got to explain away the logistical reality of what is occurring here. And the logistical reality is getting less and less feasible by the second. But he has to try and make it sound like it's all perfectly natural. And while we're on the topic, this is what Lucy said about the c-peptide. So she was asked, it was recorded that Baby F had an abnormally high level of insulin, 4657 picomoles per litre. The insulin c-peptide level was very low, less than 169. Do you want to say anything about that summary of him, Lucy? No, I don't know what those figures mean or anything. That's it. That's all she said. Again, he tried to make a big deal out of that in this closing speech. Tried to make out as if that one throwaway statement, she could even have said no comment there quite legitimately, but All she said is, I don't know what it means. And he's tried to make that out as if it's somehow incriminating. It's not incriminating, it's total rubbish, Nick. So let's just look at all the logistical problems with the allegations for Child F. Firstly, there's no bag retained. Obviously, the prosecution doesn't contest this. So nothing was ever measured directly, and there's no proof or even evidence that the bag was laced with insulin. The whole theory, as I keep saying, is entirely hypothetical. It's just something that's been concocted. There's no actual solid, substantial evidence to support this theory. The next thing is there's no attempt to give evidence when or how insulin was accessed. There's no attempt to assert that insulin was missing. And then on top of that, there's no proof that the method used in court is pharmacologically possible. Indeed, according to the experts that I've spoken with, it's likely to be pharmacologically impossible. And then it's not contested that Child F had his bag changed while Lucy Letby was absent. Then on top of that, the mechanism for injecting insulin to the bag, of course this is entirely hypothetical, as I must emphasise again, is to say the least obscure. It's highly doubtful Lucy Letby would know about the port and resealing argument that was made in court. Indeed, we can see from the police interviews that she didn't know anything about this, and it's doubtful any nurse would know anything about this, because they're told, look, this needs to be kept sealed at all times, you can't unseal the bag, and they explain the reasons for this, and the reasons are quite well known and quite obvious. What was presented in court is, again, at best, it's extremely obscure. I would say it's hypothetical and doubtful that the mechanism's even possible, let alone by someone who hasn't been shown how to do it. And then, yet again in this case, we've got the logistical administration of this methodology being dubious due to there's a massive danger that you could get caught. It's acknowledged that Lucy Letby isn't on duty on her own, so now all of a sudden she's starting to go through this bizarre thing that no one knows how to do. And then, as I've already mentioned earlier in the video, she's already used all these other supposed murder methods earlier, some of which have supposedly been successful. But then she goes to insulin for no reason. She has to do this incredibly obscure thing that I don't think any nurse would even know is possible, if it is indeed possible. And then she goes back to other murder methods, and then she goes back to insulin again, and then she even introduces some more murder methods. To say the least, it's ridiculous, and that's before we even look at the testing. So I want to mention what Private Eye has said about this in issue 34. This is not issue 34, the 34th article that Dr. Philip Hammond has written about the Lucy Letby case. The Eye has been sent 7 of the expert reports on one of the insulin babies. 5 are from the paid prosecution experts, 3 from Evans, 1 from Bohin, 1 from Hindmarsh. So I can bet the ones from Evan and Bohin are particularly great, considering that neither of them even flagged Child F as being suspicious. 1 is from a paid defence expert not called to the stand, Dr. Mike Hall, and 1 is from 3 defence experts working pro bono to assist Letby's application to CCRC, Dr. Svelena Dimitrova, Professor Alan Wayne Jones, and Dr. Adil Ismail. In addition, the Eye has a combined report of babies F and L from 7 defence experts: Wayne Jones, Ismail, Dr. Neil Ayton, Professor Matthew Yoll, Professor Charles Stanley, Dr. Richard Taylor, and Dr. Hilda Wilkinson Herbots. All the prosecution experts argue that a single insulin c-peptide blood test is proof that baby F was given insulin, and Hall says it suggests baby F had insulin injected into his blood. Dimitrova, Wayne Jones, and Ismail conclude the opposite. There were very clear reasons why baby F was hypoglycemic, very clear reasons as to why the hypoglycemia resolved when it did, and there is no evidence that exogenous insulin administration ever occurred. In turn, there is plentiful evidence of poor medical and nursing care and of misinterpretation of the medical and scientific evidence available by the expert witnesses. So who's right? The prosecution reports are paltry affairs ranging from 2 to 15 pages. The new defence reports are 60 pages and 85 pages, extensively cross-reference to the clinical records and the published literature, including new research evidence that has emerged since the trial. Length doesn't necessarily imply quality, but having read all the reports, I know which ones I believe. So there's 2 further things that I can say in addition to that. That doesn't even include the research from Professor Jeff Chase and Helen Shannon on the physical characteristics of neonates and what this can tell us about the ratios of insulin and c-peptide. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this on the channel, but Dr. Jeff Chase is an incredibly credentialed person who's quite extraordinary, but has either authored or co-authored over 1,700 reports, and over 250 of these, or I think it's approximately 250. I might be wrong in saying it's over 250. It's well over 200. I think it's about 250 are on insulin. So he's authored or co-authored 250 reports on insulin specifically. So, and then the second thing I will say is that I've seen one of the prosecution reports written by Dr. Evans, which is not on Child F, and it's extremely poor and extremely weak. Now, of course, the police cannot understand this because even by normal standards, such as myself, who doesn't have medical qualifications, we would struggle to look at medical reports. I mean, I can look at Dr. Evans' reports and say they're very poor, they're barely even A-level standard. But the police may struggle to understand this because we've seen the ignorance and stupidity of the police in previous videos. But I can say with some confidence that the prosecution reports on the insulin cases will never stand up against the defence reports. They'll be nowhere near the same standard because I've seen Dr. Evans' reports and I know how poor... Well, I haven't. I've seen one of them. I shouldn't say I've seen all of his reports. I've seen one report and I've seen how poor that is. This is supposed to be above PhD standard, and the evidence he's put forward and the quality of that report is incredibly weak. And then the final thing I just want to say is, bear in mind, these are supposed to be the strongest cases in the court case. This is supposed to be the smoking gun. When you actually look at it in detail, you see that it's extremely weak. And again, we're not looking at the specific elements of it because I don't wish to do that, because I've done it in previous videos. It's complicated, and as you can see, it's contained in these reports. So, far from being a smoking gun, these cases are piss poor, to be perfectly honest. So, just return to the comments of Mr. Johnson. I'll try to get through these as quickly as I can. Still a few pages to go. So, I just mentioned here that he's talking about that can be opened and resold contrary to what Lucy Letby said at page 5 of her Baby F interviews. So, he's trying to make it sound like she was lying, when in fact she probably just has no idea that this can be done, if indeed it can be done. Anyone who wanted to could inject about 0.6 of 1 mil of insulin. I don't know why I say 0.6 of 1 mil, it's 0.6 millilitres. And somebody did precisely that. That tiny quantity of insulin had potentially fatal consequences. So what I would say about this is that this is the problem with the pharmacological aspect of this, that the very, very small amount of insulin that was supposedly injected is very unlikely to produce the figures that have been recorded. What mental intention goes with doing that deliberate act of poisoning? Put yourself in that position. You'd never do it, of course. What is the state of mind that does something like that? This was a target attack, and it just happened that the target of the attack was the twin of the child who died under the care of Lucy Letby. So I'll try and move through these a bit more quickly because that's just waffle, which is essentially meaningless. That is no innocent coincidence, and it's not the result of some conspiracy between the doctors or anybody else at the Council of Chester. So I can agree it's not the result of a conspiracy between the doctors. It is an innocent coincidence. Absolutely it is. You will remember that in cross-examination, Lucy Letby would not be drawn on the question of Baby F, on the question of whether Baby F was targeted. So essentially, she has said, I didn't target Child F. I didn't deliberately poison Child F. I can't comment on whether anyone else on the unit deliberately poisoned Child F because she doesn't know. But we know from the evidence of multiple witnesses that insulin is never put into a TPN bag. The fact that there had been insulin in this TPN bag was spotted in 2018 by Dr. Evans when he was conducting his review. So that's just an outright lie from Dr. Evans. We know for a fact they didn't spot the insulin in the bag because when he's filed his first report, Child F wasn't among them, and secondly, the police have gone on record and said that it was Brewery who spotted the insulin cases. So that was just Dr. Evans lying, basically. I don't know why he's made this claim. It's referenced in the Court of Appeal document. It's just provably untrue. So why he's chosen to say that, I've no idea. And he told you that the case of baby F was referred to him because that of his brother baby E was suspicious. So that is very probably untrue as well. We know that he filed a report on child E before he filed a report on child F. I think he was asked to write some sort of supplementary report. He probably provided very little additional information, but we know for a fact that he was not the person that spotted these cases. That's just a fact. I mean, this second argument is of no real consequence. And Dr. Evans' conclusions were in effect confirmed by both Dr. Bohin and by Professor Peter Hindmarsh. So, the first thing is, it's not Dr. Evans' conclusions because Dr. Evans didn't put forward the insulin cases in the first place. We know that for a fact. Secondly, the conclusions of Dr. Evans are going to be extremely weak because I've seen, as I say, one of his reports and it's very poor. He's going to be extremely poor on the insulin cases because he doesn't know anything about insulin, didn't even know it could be measured in more than one way, as he admitted himself. In terms of Dr. Bohin, all she ever really does is say Dr. Evans is correct about everything. She doesn't know jack shit about insulin, to be perfectly honest. Her opinion is basically worthless. And of course, Professor Hindmarsh is significant. We know Professor Hindmarsh is this somewhat dubious character now who's been deregistered, who's been through this procedure that's been reported on by The Guardian. And considering the hypothetical nature and dubious nature, indeed, of some of the things that he's put forward in court, his whole testimony must be looked at as highly suspect now. Professor Hindmarsh told you that the half-life of insulin is 4 minutes, so I'm not going to respond to any of this because we know that there's reasonable explanations for all the numbers that come up in court, and that these are contained in reports. They're very long reports. They've seen all the medical records. No one has seen these reports in full, including myself. So I'm not going to respond to the claims of Mr. Johnson here. I'll just go over them until we get to the next point that is particularly relevant. But he just makes some claims about hypoglycemia that I may respond to quickly. I think the important point is it takes 24 minutes to get to the point of the steady state. The first contaminated bag was recorded by Lucy Letby as having been hung at 0025, and it's the tile we just saw, tile 144. At tile 161, there is a note that baby F vomited at 0130, so an hour and 5 minutes later. Do you remember Professor Hindmarsh telling us that vomiting is a sign seen in the young, which is associated with hypoglycemia, low blood sugar? So all I'll say here is that this infant essentially had naturally occurring hypoglycemia. He told us that the body's first line of defense against hypoglycemia is to produce adrenaline, and the heart rate goes up. If you look at the observations chart for baby F, we can see that sudden rising heart rate at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. We also know that by 1:54, baby F's blood sugar level was dangerously low at 0.8. Anything below, I think, 2.4 is regarded as a problem. So as I say, for the reasons mentioned, I'm not going to respond to any of this. This was a life-threatening situation for baby F. The stock bag, do you remember there was a replacement in the bag about midday that day? So at this point, Mr. Johnson is now going to go into an explanation of why it's not significant the prosecution doesn't have the bag, and the hypothetical nature of the prosecution doesn't matter, and the fact that it's unlikely that Lucy could possibly have known that an infant was going to receive a certain bag at a certain time is also impossible, and it doesn't matter that the insulin can degrade in the bag over a period of time. That doesn't matter either. Mr. Johnson has to explain away all of these things, so that is what the next passage is all about. This was a life-threatening situation for baby F. The stock bag, do you remember there was a replacement in the bag at about midday that day? And the stock bag had about the same amount of insulin in it that was connected to baby F after Lucy Letby had gone off duty. She'd have gone off for what? So I don't see how I can make that assertion because it's never been tested. She'd have gone off for whatever time it was, 8:30, whenever it was she would have left, and the stock bag was undoubtedly hung at about midday. But the important point, of course, is that, do you remember Claire Hocknell, the analyst evidence? She told you that she had reviewed the records for all the other children in the unit on the 5th of August. No other child in that unit was receiving TPN. So one child receiving TPN, how often was stock being rotated? So I've explained all of this already, so I won't dwell on it any further. Do you remember that evidence? I think we produced a stock book for you, actually, should you ever want to see it. You heard some evidence from Yvonne Griffiths about this, about the turnover of TPN stock bags in the ward, and it was a very low turnover. So taking the 5th of August as our reference date, one bag had been supplied to the unit on the 30th of June, one bag on the 16th of July, two bags on the 17th, then after this incident a single bag on the 11th of August. You've seen the layout of the fridge, haven't you? The first bag, the bespoke bag, was contaminated. We don't know that. It's just purely hypotheticals. This is just idle speculation. Easy to do the same thing to the stock bag at the front of the fridge. It was only ever going to go to one child, wasn't it? But it's so slight, isn't it? Because it's going to be connected to that child at a time when the poisoner isn't there. So, of course, Mr. Johnson has to invent this narrative to explain away all of these problems. There's no particular explanation. Why didn't Lucy Letby just do exactly the same thing to child F that she did to the twin of child E? Or why didn't she use air that hadn't been detected at all? And why did she use these arcane methods when the insulin can degrade? There's all kinds of problems and we don't know which bag's going to be hung out. All of these various things. It's because these have to be insulin poisonings because there is nothing else that can be levelled at these infants in terms of their clinical signs. So they have to explain away or attempt to explain away all the problems, the myriad of issues that there are with the supposed insulin poisoning of child F and how it makes absolutely no sense. What does that tell you about the mindset of the poisoner? Nothing, Nick. Absolutely nothing. This is why it was a targeted attack. We will come to the point a bit later in the next case, baby L. You know that the insulin was put in while the bag was hanging for baby L, but what better way for a poisoner to cover their tracks than to leave a replacement bag in the fridge to be used by an unsuspecting colleague, a member of her family? Well, and this is almost absurd speculation at this point of view. As you know, there's numerous other things that Lucy could have done that you've already alleged that she did do. It makes absolutely no sense for her to do this. Like, on the one hand, you're saying she knew she'd covered her own tracks because she knew that she could insert insulin into the bag without being detected. And she thought she didn't know about the c-peptide level. That's supposed to be significant. So that's supposed to mean that she thought she could inject insulin and no one would ever know. But now she needs a way to cover her tracks while not being the person that hangs up the bag. It was described by Ben Myers as a Russian doll of absurdity, I believe, or something along those lines. He used the term Russian doll. I forget the exact words he used. But I mean, this is being presented as a fait accompli, as almost inevitable, when of course it's anything but. And it's very, very clear that logistically, before you even look at the science, the logistics of it are absurd. Of course, it hasn't been measured, and then, as I say, the science of it doesn't add up either. It shows a degree of cynical, cold-blooded planning, doesn't it? No, it doesn't, because you don't have a bag. You don't even know that a bag has ever been spiked with insulin. You don't have any direct measurements. You don't know any insulin went missing. You made no effort to prove any of these things. Because not only would it thwart the remedial step of replacing the bag, it would also divert suspicion onto somebody else and deflect suspicion from Lucy Letby. The question of whether it was legitimate to infer the insulin contamination in the first bag, sort of bespoke bag from the results of the blood test taken from child F at 1756, when he was on the second bag, was also explored by Peter Hindmarsh, wasn't it? And he said that it was legitimate. So no, it was legitimate to infer from the insulin c-peptide results from the blood sample that the level of contamination in both bags was about the same. I mean, that sounds great, doesn't it? That sounds scientific. That sounds like something that has a lot of legitimacy. So that tells us quite a lot as well, doesn't it, ladies and gentlemen? No. It tells us that whoever poisoned baby F gave it some thought. I mean, this is, you can see, this is an extraordinary narrative that's being put together here. I mean, it is a pure invention, as is so much of this court case. So much of this court case is just fabricating things, misrepresenting things, pulling things out of the ether, and this is just another great example. Because they put the same amount into the replacement bag as well that might have been used. You don't know that because you don't know, because you haven't got the bags. So when you're thinking about whether or not this is a conspiracy by the Gang of Four, whether you're thinking about whether or not staffing levels had anything to do with this, or even the drains of the sink in Nursery 1, we invite you to bear all that in mind. When she was being interviewed, Lucy Letby told some interesting lies about baby F. So, obviously he's trying to discredit things that Lucy said, but again, it shouldn't. We've seen it in the police interviews, then we saw it in the court case. I've discussed this already. It's not Lucy Letby's role or responsibility to try and explain everything that occurred on the unit. There is a conspiracy by the Gang of Four against Lucy Letby. Absolutely. We know that for a fact. You're going to read about that in my book. You've heard about it on this channel. I don't think it was a deliberate conspiracy in the sense that I don't believe they deliberately targeted her. But there's no doubt that they conspired against her. They just believed that they were doing the right thing at the start, in my opinion, although I know a lot of you disagree with me. And that can be inferred from what has occurred, and you may be right. However, I can't prove that, so I would prefer to say that I'm not convinced that they targeted her deliberately. But I do think there was a conspiracy in terms of them conspiring against her. They definitely did. They definitely scapegoated her. That's undeniable. They just thought that the ends justified the means, in my opinion. I know some of you disagree with that, but when he's talking here about whether or not this is a conspiracy, absolutely is. No doubt. Talking about staffing levels, I would actually agree that staffing levels do have nothing to do with this infant, but this infant hasn't been poisoned. And again, it's not that I agree. It's not necessarily the drains or the sink or infection with this infant. I don't think off the top of my head Child F was one of the infants that was septic, as far as I recall. But I could be wrong about that because there's so many, it's difficult to remember them. I'm not going to look it up right now. I'll just concede this point for the sake of argument. But it's essentially of no relevance. It's just Nick Johnson engaging in smear tactics, basically. So let's hear about Lucy's supposed lies. Bear in mind that you've just made an assertion from Dr. Evans that we know is a lie, that we know is untrue. So let's hear about the supposed lies Lucy told. You know, like the lies about pyjamas, for example. You know that she has an exceptional memory for the details of these cases, do we, Nick? I didn't know that because a lot of the time you try to pretend that she hasn't got a good memory and that she's forgetting important things. She corrected me several times when I got the detail wrong, didn't she? I don't mind that. I do get things wrong. Yeah, that's absolutely true. No doubt in due course you'll be told that I've got some of the details of what I'm saying to you now wrong, and you could be the judges of that. It's not so much that you've got them wrong. I mean, they're just fabricated. So this is all entirely an invention. So I'm sure some of the details are wrong. I'm sure you will have got some of the details wrong. You made persistent mistakes all the way through the court case. But it's not so much that this is wrong, or what the details of it are wrong. It's invented in the first place. So it doesn't matter about the details. The details are almost irrelevant. If I have, I apologise, and it's not deliberate. But Lucy Letby, she's right on it, isn't she? Right on the detail of this case. And yet, in an interview with police in 2019, she claimed that she wasn't aware of there having been any concerns about baby F's blood sugars. And you know that she was lying about that because of the text message she sent to Nurse A. So we can't really say that was a lie. I think it's far more likely that Lucy forgot about that because, firstly, this wasn't a particularly significant infant to her because, as we've established, she wasn't the on-duty nurse for Child F. That's the first thing. Secondly, on a unit in which many infants died, this unit did not die, so it wasn't seen as a particularly significant infant. Indeed, it wasn't seen as significant by the hospital at the time, as evidenced by the fact they haven't done proper testing, they haven't retained the bags, etc., etc. So this is just a throwaway message that Lucy has made while off duty. 4 years prior to this, she's been through all kinds of earth-shattering, life-destroying events since then. I think we can cut her a little bit of slack and say she could possibly, conceivably, have forgotten about this isolated text message. So these are the final two paragraphs of Johnson's comments on Child F in the closing speech. As I said to you before, in interview she was asking the police whether the bag had been kept or had been checked. She knew what the answer would be. How? How, Nick? How did she know what the answer would be? It's not her infant. She wasn't on duty. The only reason, I've obviously read this out already, the only reason she's asking is she wants the bag to be checked to give her exonerating information, exonerating evidence. She doesn't know. If she knew whether or not the bag had been kept, she wouldn't have asked. On the second occasion she was interviewed, she repeated that question. She was taunting the police. I thought that you didn't want to assert that she taunted them, but you've said it twice now. So I think a pretty likely explanation for this, Nick, is that this was a year later. I don't have the information for this because I don't have this interview, but she probably said, "Have you recovered the bag for child F?" Still seeking exonerating evidence for herself because she's being faced with the prospect of multiple life sentences while an innocent person. To say she's taunting the police is a statement that's without any foundation. When she came back for a final interview in November 2020, the police broke the news of c-peptide to her. You'll find that at page 22. Lucy Letby's obsessive and surreptitious following of the mother of baby E and F on the internet was never satisfactorily explained, was it? So we know for a fact that Lucy made very few searches for the parents. It's not particularly unusual. It can't reasonably be described as obsessive. Whether or not you can describe it as surreptitious is debatable because all internet searches are anonymous. I don't think you can really reasonably call it surreptitious. It's always going to be anonymous because you're searching for someone online, and indeed it's not appropriate for you necessarily to contact that person. She undoubtedly poisoned baby F, who just happened to be the twin of the baby she had murdered the previous day. Cold, calculating, cruel, and relentless. So these are just I don't obviously it's his job to prosecute. A lot of these problems are to do with the system. I just want to mention that as a closing point. It becomes more and more evident the more you look at the court case how inadequate the adversarial system is and how it just cannot deal with cases of this nature, because Nick Johnson, it's his job to go in there and do all these things, use all these deflection techniques, use all these techniques of invention, try to link together things for which there is absolutely no link, take things out of context, use things in a context which it clearly wasn't intended at the time, attach great significance to things that are actually really trivial. Sometimes, of course, he outright lies. He certainly fabricates things, he certainly misrepresents things, he certainly invents things, and so forth. And a lot of that is just a failure of the system. As much as we may blame Johnson himself, the reality is that another barrister may have done exactly the same or certainly something very similar to what Nick Johnson did in this court case. What we can also say is that recording this video did make me angry because this is supposed to be strong evidence. This is supposed to be the strongest case in the court case, and I still see people online citing this as some sort of bulletproof evidence that Lucy Letby is guilty, whereas you can see it's just absolute nonsense. And I think it's embarrassing that there are people online who still push this as if it's a smoking gun, when of course it's anything but. And we haven't even been into the deep medical evidence in this case, which disproves it even further still, leaving aside the fact that the whole premise of what is being suggested here is ludicrous. In summary, let me pull together the key points from this video. Firstly, and most importantly, the prosecution's claim about child F rests on a series of inferences, not direct physical proof. What was heard in court and what we have just reviewed relies heavily on assumptions that a feeding bag was deliberately tampered with, that insulin was introduced into that bag, and that those actions can only be explained by someone intending harm. None of those steps were directly demonstrated, they were all inferred. Secondly, the supposed smoking gun tests were not the robust, validated forensic results that were asserted in court. The lab evidence presented was presumptive and fragile. There was no preserved feeding bag from child F, no documented chain showing insulin was removed from a fridge, and no uncontested physical trace that would incontrovertibly show insulin was introduced into a bag. What we have instead are hypothetical scenarios mapped onto partial test results, and that makes the conclusions misleading rather than definitive, as was suggested by Mr. Johnson. Thirdly, the logic used to infer intent is weak. The argument moves from Lucy didn't know about c-peptide to therefore she must have intended to poison. That is an enormous leap in faith that doesn't follow logically, and that is unsupported by the material referenced by Johnson. Knowledge of a biochemical test, or lack of it, does not equal proof of motive or action. Similarly, patterns like she was on shift, therefore guilty, are rhetorical power plays more than anything that approaches proof. Fourthly, the scientific testimony itself has been contested. New reports have been written in defence of Lucy Letby, and these are clearly far stronger than those that were submitted by the prosecution for the original court case. Defence and independent voices note that neonatal physiology, especially in very small babies, can produce the blood patterns that were seen without exogenous insulin being administered. In plain terms, newborns are not small adults. Their bodies can behave unpredictably and sometimes mimic the laboratory signatures that the prosecution attributed to outside interference. Fifthly, the logistics of the alleged tampering are implausible in many ways. The method that the prosecution suggested, accessing and resealing an aseptic TPN bag without detection, would be technically tricky and not something an ordinary member of staff would know how to do. There was no evidence that such a method had been practiced by the accused or that she had the opportunity or knowledge to do this, even if it is actually possible, which is also doubtful. Sixthly, the prosecuting barrister has reproduced claims from Dr. Evans that we know to be false. The Court of Appeal would later repeat these claims. Finally, alternative clinical explanations exist for the infants, and the calibre of reports related to these is undeniably far stronger than those from the prosecution. I also want to be clear about how courtroom dynamics shape what you heard. A prosecutor's job is to construct a persuasive narrative. That's what barristers do. They arrange facts into a story that supports their theory, and sometimes they don't even have any facts to do this. This is required in the adversarial system. Conversely, scientific rigour requires validated methods, preserved samples, and reproducible analysis. When those elements are missing, a persuasive story can still be just that, a story. The insulin cases remain weak evidence of malfeasance, which is why they weren't even flagged by the hospital at the time. In common with every single case in this court case, as standalone cases they would never reach the courtroom. With regard to the comments of Mr. Johnson, they are almost entirely reliant on fabrication, misrepresentation, misdirection, and other prosecutorial tricks. Mr. Johnson may have done what he believes to be his job, but justice has been poorly served by his conduct.